I froze outside the study door the instant I heard my own name. "Your sister gets the company," my father said. "She gets nothing." My mother's laugh followed, bright and cruel. 25 years of being their daughter, and I had never once felt like one of them. I said nothing. I walked upstairs, calm on the outside, already replaying every strange folder I had once glimpsed in that drawer. By midnight, I found the one document that would end everything they thought they knew about me. Warm lamplight leaked under the study door. The grandfather clock at the end of the hall ticked once, twice, and then Boyd Prescott, 62 years old and built from his own father's blueprints and his own ruthlessness, said the sentence that undid 25 years of my life. I froze mid-step in the hallway when I heard my father say my name, not the way he said it at dinner or across the office. This was the way you say a name when the person attached to it isn't supposed to hear what comes next. Warm lamplight leaked under the study door. The grandfather clock at the end of the hall ticked once, twice, and then Boyd Prescott, 62 years old and built from his own father's blueprints and his own ruthlessness, said the sentence that undid 25 years of my life. Hadley gets everything: the house, the company, the investments. Keira doesn't get a single dollar. I pressed my palm against the cold brass handle and held it there like a pulse I was checking. Through the door, I could hear Hadley, my 35-year-old sister, murmur something I couldn't make out, her voice accepting every promise our father laid at her feet without question. Then came the sound that finished me. Lorraine Prescott, 59, silver bob catching the lamplight, let out a laugh so sharp it could have frosted the windows. She was never really built for this family anyway. Have you ever heard something about yourself that rearranged every memory you had, turned every warm moment cold? That laugh did it. Every birthday when Lorraine kissed my forehead, every holiday when she squeezed my hand during grace, every time she called me sweetheart, all of it restructured in a single breath into something performed. I was 37 years old. I had spent the last decade growing Prescott Pacific Construction from a $2 million outfit into a firm worth nearly $16 million. I had signed the contracts, managed the crews, negotiated the permits, while Boyd recovered from back surgery and Hadley studied art history in Portland. And now I stood in a dark hallway, learning I was worth nothing to the people I had given everything. The bourbon smell drifted under the door. Old leather. Boyd's world, sealed and certain. I didn't knock. I didn't confront them. I backed away from the door on bare feet, and the only thing louder than my heartbeat was a memory. My grandfather Orrin's voice, years ago, his hand on my shoulder. "A part of this company will always belong to you, Keiki." I held that word against Lorraine's laugh and let it burn. 3 hours later, the house was dark. Boyd's study door was unlocked. The man who controlled everything had never imagined anyone would walk into his private room uninvited. That was the kind of confidence that comes from never being challenged. I found the mahogany drawer locked, but the key was where it had always been, tucked behind a framed photograph of Boyd and Orrin at a groundbreaking ceremony. My fingers were steady as I turned it. The adoption certificate was dated 3 months after my 3rd birthday. 25 years. They had 25 years to tell me, and they chose every single day not to. I sat on the floor of that study with the document in my lap and felt my identity come apart like a house built on sand. The Prescott name I'd carried, the family dinners, the inside jokes, the way Boyd used to call me his little engineer when I was 12, all of it was scaffolding around a lie. I wasn't their daughter. I never had been. Beneath the adoption certificate was a manila folder labeled in Boyd's handwriting, "Silence Payment." Inside were bank transfer records, monthly payments, substantial ones, sent to a woman I had never heard of. The name on the account was Leilani Voss. My hands were steady when I photographed the invoices. They were steady when I opened the financial files beneath them, offshore transfer records, account numbers I didn't recognize, dollar amounts that didn't match any project I'd managed. They did not stay steady when I read the name Leilani Voss a second time and saw the notation at the bottom of the final transfer: deceased, payments terminated. Someone had been paying this woman for years. And when she died, the payments stopped, not because the obligation ended, but because the person they were keeping quiet was gone. I photographed every page. My mouth tasted like copper and adrenaline and something else, the dry, metallic flavor of a life rearranging itself in real time. The smell of bourbon and old paper surrounded me like a confession I hadn't asked for. I closed the drawer, replaced the key, stood in the dark study with my phone full of photographs and my chest full of something I didn't have a name for yet. And then one detail surfaced through the wreckage, quiet and precise. 6 weeks ago, while Boyd was recovering from back surgery, he had signed power of attorney over to me. A routine precaution. Temporary, he'd said. No one had ever revoked it. My phone buzzed on the desk. A bank notification. Routine. Meaningless to anyone who wasn't already thinking what I was thinking. I picked it up, slid the phone into my pocket, and walked out of that study without making a sound. The hallway was dark, the house was silent, and for the first time in 25 years, I understood that the people who raised me had never planned to give me anything, which meant that whatever I was going to take, I would have to take myself. The streets of Kailua were empty at midnight, and so was every excuse I had left not to do this. I drove with the windows down, the trade winds pulling at my hair, the photographs still glowing on my phone in the passenger seat, like evidence that hadn't decided yet what it wanted to become. The bank notification had been routine, an automated balance summary I received every Monday. But tonight, it read like an invitation, or a dare. The Prescott Pacific Construction office in Kaka'ako sat dark against the Honolulu skyline. I parked in the underground garage where my keycard still worked, rode the elevator to the 4th floor, and stepped into the kind of silence that only exists in buildings that were built for noise. Stale air, someone's forgotten coffee mug on a neighboring desk, the distant hum of the server room pushing through the walls like a heartbeat the building didn't know it had. I sat at my terminal, and the screen cast the only light on the floor, blue-white, clinical, the color of operating rooms and decisions that can't be undone. I pulled up the financial management system, the same system I had designed, implemented, and maintained for a decade. Every access protocol, every security layer, every routing pathway, I had built them all. Boyd had the title. I had the architecture. 10 years I had managed these accounts. They forgot I still had the keys. Not metaphorical keys, real ones. Admin credentials that hadn't been rotated because nobody imagined the person who built the vault would ever need to open it for herself. You want to know what it feels like to move money out of your own family's accounts at midnight. It doesn't feel like stealing. It feels like surgery, cutting out what's rotten before it kills the patient. The company had 112 employees who depended on paychecks that Boyd treated like personal currency. If what I found in that study was what I thought it was, offshore transfers, silence payments, an entire second ledger hidden behind a locked drawer, then those employees were standing on a trapdoor, and my father's hand was on the lever. I created the trust first, named it the Prescott Employee Protection Fund. Every keystroke documented, every action logged, every legal justification typed into the memo field. with the precision of someone who knew. This would be examined under fluorescent lights by people with subpoena power. The city lights spread across the harbor through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Somewhere out there, Boyd slept in a house I had helped pay for, beside a woman who laughed at the idea of me, above a study full of secrets he never thought I would find. I initiated the first transfer, $200,000. The system processed it in 11 seconds. Each transaction was a door closing behind me. Click, click, click. No handles on the other side. I moved through the accounts methodically. Operating reserves, project escrow, the capital improvement fund, the insurance holdback. Every pool of liquid capital that could be drained, redirected, or frozen by someone with the wrong intentions. I routed each one into the trust with documentation so clean a forensic accountant would find nothing but good faith. My tongue was dry. I hadn't had water in hours. The adrenaline left a bitter film on the roof of my mouth that tasted like pennies and permanence. Somewhere around the 14th transfer, I paused. Not because I doubted what I was doing, but because I understood what I was losing. If I finished this, there was no version of tomorrow where I was still their daughter. Not the grateful one, not the quiet one, not the one who showed up at Sunday dinners and pretended the silences between courses were comfortable. That woman would be gone by morning. I looked at the screen. The cursor blinked. The server hummed. I pressed enter. The transfers continued for another hour and 42 minutes. I documented every one. $6.8 million in liquid assets. The entire movable treasury of Prescott Pacific Construction, relocated into a trust that Boyd couldn't touch, Lorraine couldn't spend, and Hadley couldn't inherit. Not stolen. Protected. Every cent accounted for. Every cent legal under the power of attorney that nobody had remembered to revoke. At 2:47 in the morning, the final confirmation flashed green. I sat back in my chair and felt the office settle around me like a held breath releasing. The screen glowed, the server hummed, and something inside me, the part that had spent 25 years being their daughter, went quiet. Not dead, just finished. I reached for my phone to check the confirmation email. Before my fingers touched the screen, it lit up on its own. An incoming call. No contact name, just a number I didn't recognize. 2:47 in the morning, and someone was calling me at the office where no one was supposed to be. Someone was awake. Someone already knew. I stared at the phone, vibrating against the desk, the green confirmation still glowing on the monitor behind it, and I understood that whatever I had just started was already bigger than a family argument about money. The phone buzzed a third time. I picked it up. I answered the call at 2:47 in the morning. The voice on the other end belonged to the bank's automated fraud detection system, a robotic prompt asking me to confirm a series of large transactions on the Prescott Pacific account. I pressed one for yes, ended the call, and sat in the dark office laughing at myself for expecting something more dramatic. 5 hours later, I sat down at the breakfast table, knowing I was no longer their daughter. The only question was how long it would take them to figure that out. Morning sunlight cut across the kitchen in gold slabs. Lorraine had set out Kona coffee and toast and sliced papaya, the same breakfast she'd arranged every morning for 30 years, as if routine could substitute for warmth. Boyd sat at the head of the table, reading his phone with one hand and eating with the other, the posture of a man who believed the world would wait for him to finish chewing. I poured my coffee. Black, steady hands. The mug was cool ceramic against my fingers, and I held it like an anchor. Boyd's phone buzzed against the granite countertop. He glanced down. Then he stopped chewing. His knuckles went white around the phone case, and for 3 full seconds, nobody at that table breathed. $6.8 million, he said. his voice low and flat, the voice he used when he was calculating whether to explode or strategize. Where the hell did it go? Who authorized this? There is a particular kind of silence that happens when a man who has controlled everything for 30 years realizes he's lost control of the one thing that matters most. It doesn't sound like quiet. It sounds like the air leaving a room. Lorraine set down her fork. Hadley looked up from her phone. I took a sip of coffee that tasted like cardboard and said the words I'd been rehearsing since the drive home. The authority you signed over to me 6 weeks ago, no one revoked it. Boyd's fist hit the table. The juice glasses rattled. A piece of papaya slid off Lorraine's plate, and nobody reached for it. You had no right, he started. I had every right. You made sure of that yourself. He stood up so fast, his chair scraped across the tile like a shriek. I didn't flinch. I'd spent all night preparing for this exact moment, and the strange thing was, it was smaller than I'd imagined. Boyd Prescott, at full volume, was just a man yelling in a kitchen, and I had stopped being afraid of men yelling in kitchens somewhere around 2 a.m. I told him the funds were in a legally documented trust designed to protect the company's employees and operational obligations. I told him every transaction was logged, justified, and executed under valid authority. I did not tell him about the study, the adoption certificate, or the name I had found in his locked drawer. Those cards stayed in my hand. Boyd grabbed his keys. Lorraine grabbed her purse, the strap swinging as she stood. This is what happens when you give responsibility to someone who doesn't understand loyalty, she said. Not to me, to the room, to the air, to the version of events she was already constructing for the attorney. They were gone in 90 seconds. The front door slammed hard enough to rattle the framed photographs in the hallway. Then silence filled the kitchen like water filling a basin, slow, heavy, and impossible to push back. Lorraine's words hung in the air like smoke from a grease fire, toxic, clinging, impossible to ignore. I sat with my coffee and let them settle. The plumeria outside the lanai door sent its sweetness through the screen, indifferent to everything happening inside. Hadley hadn't moved. She sat across from me with her coffee held in both hands, her eyes doing something I hadn't expected. Not the outrage I'd prepared for, not the accusation. Something underneath, a look I recognized because I'd felt it on my own face 12 hours ago. Fear. The specific fear of someone who suspects the ground beneath them isn't solid. Have you ever looked at someone you grew up with, someone who shared your cereal bowls and your childhood bedroom, and realized you might be strangers? That's what the kitchen felt like. 2 women at a table, surrounded by the debris of a family breakfast that had become a crime scene. What did you do? Hadley asked. Quiet, not angry, searching. What I had to. That's not an answer. I know. I set down my mug. The condensation left a ring on the granite. Outside, a mynah bird screamed at something in the yard, and the normalcy of it felt obscene. We need to talk, I said, about the company and about things much older than that. Hadley set down her coffee with both hands. She looked straight at me, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. What did you find in Dad's study last night? I heard you in there. The kitchen went cold. The plumeria kept drifting. The mynah bird went quiet. She had been awake. She had heard the drawers. How much truth do you give the sister who might still be your enemy? Hadley sat across from me in the empty kitchen, her coffee held like a shield, and I could see the sleepless circles under her eyes. She had heard me in the study. She knew I had been in the drawers. The question was whether she was asking because she wanted the truth or because she planned to deliver it to Boyd before he got back from the lawyer's office. I gave her the middle, not the adoption certificate, not the name I'd found, just enough to see which way she'd lean. I found financial irregularities, I said, in the company accounts, Transfers that don't match any project I've ever managed. Money going places it shouldn't go. Hadley's jaw tightened. If there are problems with the company, why didn't you go to Dad instead of stealing from it? Because Dad is the problem, Hadley. She didn't answer right away. Her fingers traced the rim of her mug, and the distant surf through the open window filled the silence between us. I watched her wrestle with it, the instinct to defend Boyd, fighting against something she hadn't said out loud yet. He told me about the inheritance 2 weeks ago, she said finally, her voice dropping. Sat me down in that study and laid it out like a business proposal, not like a father talking to his daughter, like a man handing me a leash, not a gift. For the first time in my life, my sister looked at me without the armor. Just for a second, her eyes open, her defenses lowered, the real Hadley visible beneath the one Boyd had shaped. Then she put it back on, straightened in her chair, and said she needed to think. I let her go. The crack was small, but it was real, and I knew better than to force it wider before it was ready. That afternoon, I locked my bedroom door and opened my laptop on the bed. The screen glowed against the afternoon shadows, and I typed the name that had been burning in my head since midnight. Leilani Voss. Searching for her felt like pulling a thread on a sweater I had worn my entire life. One tug, and the whole thing could unravel. But I pulled anyway, because the alternative was wearing a lie forever and pretending it still fit. The results were sparse. A few social media profiles that didn't match, a university alumni page from the early 90s, and then, halfway down the second page, a newspaper article from the Honolulu Star-Bulletin dated 25 years ago. The headline was small. Local stories about car accidents don't make front pages, but the details were precise enough to stop my breathing. A single-car accident on the Pali Highway, late at night. Wet road, sharp curve, no other vehicles involved. The driver was a 26-year-old social work student named Leilani Voss. She was pronounced dead at the scene. 3 months after I was adopted, I read the article twice, then a third time. The laptop was warm on my thighs, and the room smelled like plumeria drifting through the window, and neither of those things registered because my entire brain was consumed by arithmetic. The adoption certificate was dated 3 months before this woman died. The silence payments in Boyd's drawer started the same year. They never stopped. 26 years old, a social work student, a single-car accident on the Pali Highway, and a payment schedule that started the month they put her in the ground. I pulled up the photographs from my phone, the payment ledger I'd captured in Boyd's study. My hands were steady as I scrolled through the images, matching dates against the article, cross-referencing the account name. The payments weren't a one-time settlement. They were annual, consistent, ongoing for a quarter century, sent to someone with the last name Voss. The metallic taste was back on my tongue. Cold coffee sat forgotten on the nightstand, bitter and hours old. I stared at the screen and felt the story of my life rearranging itself again. Not the violent upheaval of last night, but something slower and more permanent, like watching a foundation crack in real time and knowing the house above it would never be level again. I scrolled to the bottom of the article. The reporter had included one detail in the final paragraph, almost as an afterthought, the kind of sentence that fills column inches without meaning anything to anyone except the people it destroys. The victim was survived by one family member, a sister, interviewed briefly by police in the days following the accident. Her name was listed in the article the way you list someone who doesn't matter to the story yet. I looked at the name. Then I looked at the silence payment ledger on my phone. They matched. Boyd had been paying Leilani Voss's own sister for 25 years. Not a stranger, not a lawyer, not an institution, a sister. The aunt I never knew I had, receiving money from the man who raised me, for reasons I was only beginning to understand. I closed the laptop. The room was quiet. The plumeria kept drifting through the window like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. And somewhere on this island, a woman named Voss had been cashing checks from my father for longer than I'd been alive. I went to the office that evening because I needed to be somewhere my father's walls couldn't watch me think. The discovery about Leilani's sister was still turning in my head like a gear that wouldn't stop. An aunt I'd never known existed, receiving payments from the man who raised me for reasons no one had ever explained. I needed space. I needed the fluorescent hum of the Kaka'ako office and the view of the harbor at dusk and a desk that didn't sit inside a house built on secrets. I was reviewing project files on my terminal, cross-referencing account numbers from the photographs on my phone, when I heard footsteps in the empty corridor. Not the janitor, too hesitant, too deliberate. The cleaning solution smell from the freshly mopped hallway drifted in, and then a silhouette appeared in my doorway. Gil Stanton, 56, the staff accountant who had balanced Prescott Pacific's books for 18 years, stood with his messenger bag clutched across his chest like a shield. He checked behind him once, then twice, and stepped inside my office without being invited. "I need to talk to you," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper, pitched just under the air conditioning, cycling through the empty building. "And I need you to understand that what I'm about to say could cost me everything." I gestured to the chair across from my desk. He didn't sit. He stood with his hands on the back of it, and the faint smell of cologne mixed with anxious sweat told me he'd been building up to this conversation for longer than just tonight. "I've watched numbers disappear from this company for 11 months, Gil said. Invoice totals that don't match the contracts, transfers routed through vendors I can't verify, money leaving this company in ways that never come back as anything real. Sometimes the person who saves you isn't the hero. It's the quiet man in the corner office who kept receipts because his conscience wouldn't let him sleep." Gil Stanton had spent 18 years doing exactly what Boyd asked, and for the last 11 months he'd been watching the company he helped build get hollowed out from the inside, too afraid to speak, too honest to look away. "I kept my mouth shut because I have a mortgage and a daughter in college," he said. "Boyd signs my paychecks. Boyd approved my health insurance when my wife needed surgery 3 years ago. You don't bite the hand that signs your daughter's tuition checks." "Why are you telling me now?" Gil finally sat down. The leather of his bag strap was worn smooth where his hand had been gripping it. He looked at the desk, at the dark window, at the distant traffic crawling through Kaka'ako below, anywhere but at me. "Because last night, someone moved the entire liquid treasury into a protected trust, and I figured whoever did that isn't planning to stay quiet either. What does it cost a man to stay silent for 11 months when he knows his boss is gutting the company from the inside?" I looked at Gil's face and saw the answer written in the lines around his eyes. It cost him sleep. It cost him weight. His collar was loose, his cheeks thinner than I remembered. It cost him the version of himself that used to believe doing good work for a good company was enough. "How bad is it?" I asked. Jill leaned forward. "The inflated invoices alone total over $2 million in the last year, but that's just what runs through the regular books. There's a second layer, offshore transfers to a shell entity I can't identify. Different routing numbers, different authorization codes. Someone set up a parallel accounting structure, and whoever did it knew exactly how to keep it invisible to a standard audit. Boyd, I can't prove it from inside the system. The authorization trail is clean, too clean. Someone who knows how corporate accounting works built those walls." He paused, The fluorescent light above us buzzed and flickered once, then steadied. But I can prove the money moved, and I can prove where some of it went. Gil's hands were steady when he talked about the invoices. They shook when he talked about his daughter's tuition and what Boyd could do to a man who talked. I watched his fingers tremble against the worn leather of his bag, and I understood that this man hadn't come to me because he was brave. He'd come because he couldn't carry it alone anymore. He reached into his messenger bag and pulled out a flash drive, small, black, unremarkable. He set it on my desk under the lamp, and it caught the light like a piece of evidence that already knew what it was. Invoices, wire confirmations, vendor shell companies, 11 months of it. If you need proof, I kept copies. He slid it toward me. The cold plastic pressed against my palm as I picked it up. I have duplicates in a lockbox outside the office. I always knew this day would come. I closed my hand around the drive. My mouth was dry, the taste of stale vending machine coffee still coating my tongue. Gil stood to leave, then stopped. He turned back with his hand on the doorframe. There's one more thing, a monthly payment I couldn't trace. Same amount every month for as long as I've been with this company. It goes to someone off the books entirely. No name, no vendor code, just a routing number and a dollar amount that never changes. I already knew who it went to, but I didn't say that, not yet. I didn't tell Gil about the monthly payment, not yet. He'd tracked it as an anomaly, a recurring transfer with no vendor code, no name, no explanation. I already knew it led to a woman named Voss on the island of Maui, and I wasn't ready to explain how I knew that or what it meant about who I was. I chose a cafe in Manoa because nobody from Prescott Pacific had ever set foot in that valley, and because what was on that flash drive needed to stay between two people and a corner booth. Morning Glass Coffee sat tucked behind a strip of banyan trees, the kind of place where graduate students nursed pour-overs for 3 hours, and nobody looked twice at two people hunched over a laptop. The evening rain had started, and the smell of wet pavement mixed with dark roast drifted through the propped open door. Gil arrived with his messenger bag tight against his side. He slid into the booth across from me, ordered nothing, and watched me plug the flash drive into my laptop. The first file opened, and the scope of what Boyd had done stopped being abstract. "Start with this one," Gil said, turning the screen slightly toward himself. His voice dropped below the hiss of the espresso machine. "Kapolei Housing Project, Phase 2. General contractor invoices from a company called Kailua Coast Supply." I scanned the spreadsheet. Materials, labor, equipment rental, standard line items for a residential build. The numbers looked clean until Gil pointed to the vendor payment column. Kailua Coast Supply doesn't have a warehouse, a phone number, or a single employee, he said. It's a P.O. box registered in Nevada. Every invoice it submitted was paid in full within 48 hours. No inspection, no delivery confirmation, no questions. Looking at those invoices was like watching an X-ray of my father's character. Every fraudulent line was a fracture I'd spent my whole life refusing to see. The numbers were precise, methodical, almost elegant in their dishonesty. 40,000 skimmed here, 80,000 there, always just below the threshold that would trigger an automatic audit flag. "How many shell companies are there?" I asked. "4 that I've found. There could be more." Gil pulled up a second spreadsheet. Kailua Coast Supply, Pacific Ridge Materials, Harborline Logistics, and one called Meridian Development Partners that only appears on 3 invoices but moved more money than the other 3 combined. 4 shell companies, 18 months of duplicate payments, over $1 million siphoned through fake vendors alone. And that was before we even touched the offshore transfers. The condensation from my untouched pour-over left rings on the wooden table, and the coffee had gone cold and acidic, but I couldn't bring myself to care about anything except the columns of numbers scrolling across my screen. Gil walked me through each vendor methodically. He'd color-coded his notes, green for confirmed legitimate payments, red for the ghost invoices, yellow for transactions he couldn't classify. The yellow ones worried him most. "These are the wire transfers I was telling you about," he said, opening a third file. "They don't go through the vendor payment system at all. Different routing numbers, different authorization codes. Someone set up a completely separate channel for moving this money." "Boyd, almost certainly, but here's the problem." Gil leaned back and rubbed his eyes. The murmur of college students at the far tables filled the pause. 6 months ago, Boyd changed the routing passwords on the offshore accounts, locked me out entirely, said it was a security upgrade. I haven't been able to see those transactions since. How do you sit across from a man who risked his career to keep receipts of your father's crimes and not wonder how many others noticed and chose to look away? Gil had spent 11 months documenting what he could reach, knowing the deepest layer was hidden behind a wall Boyd had built specifically to keep people like him out. "The domestic skimming is bad enough to trigger a federal investigation," Gil said quietly. "But it's just the surface. The offshore accounts, that's where the real money went. Whatever Boyd is hiding behind those passwords is bigger than anything on this drive." I gripped the flash drive in my left hand. The plastic was warm now, shaped by my palm. The rain outside had picked up, drumming against the cafe's awning, and the smell of wet earth pushed through the open door like the island itself was leaning in to listen. "You still have system admin access, don't you?" Gil asked. I looked at him. He wasn't asking casually. He'd thought about this. "Boyd never revoked it," I said. "There's a password-locked folder on the company server. Boyd created it himself 6 months ago, the same week he changed the routing passwords." Gil zipped his bag slowly, his hands steady now that the hardest part of the conversation was behind him. "I've never been able to open it, but the file size is enormous. Whatever's in there, it's not a few invoices." He stood, slung the bag over his shoulder, and looked down at me with an expression I recognized. It was the look of a man transferring a burden he'd been carrying alone for too long. "If there's a second set of books," he said, "it's in that folder." The rain kept falling. The cafe kept humming. And I sat in that corner booth with a flash drive full of fraud and a set of admin credentials that my father had forgotten I still held. I drove back to the Kaka'ako office that night with Gil's warning echoing in my head. Enormous file size, password locked, created the same week Boyd cut off access to the offshore routing. Whatever he was hiding, he'd built a wall around it, and then forgotten that the woman who designed the building's entire digital infrastructure still had the master key, the password. Boyd used to lock the folder was my mother's maiden name, Lorraine's maiden name, I should say, because she was never really my mother. I typed it on the first try, and the irony tasted like ash. The folder opened at 10:14 in the evening. The office was dark except for my monitor, the hard drive, whirring in the silence like a mechanical heartbeat, counting down to something it couldn't stop. Recycled air conditioning pushed the faint chemical scent of printer toner from the copy room next door, and the building creaked the way empty buildings do, settling into itself, indifferent to the woman sitting at a fourth-floor terminal, dismantling her father's empire one file at a time. The first documents were wire transfer confirmations. 18 months of them, organized by date, routed to 3 separate offshore accounts. I opened the account registration summaries and felt my jaw tighten. The primary account holder was listed under initials BKP, Boyd Kenneth Prescott, on an offshore account. He hadn't even tried to hide. He had just assumed no one in his family would ever dare to look. I scrolled through the transfers. The amounts varied. 60,000 here, 140,000 there. But the cadence was steady, monthly, relentless, like a pulse. I ran the totals in my head as I scrolled, and by the time I reached the most recent entry, the number had crossed $2.4 million. That was on top of the domestic invoice fraud Gil had documented. Combined, Boyd had siphoned enough money from Prescott Pacific to bankrupt a mid-size firm, and he'd done it while I was managing the projects that generated the revenue he was stealing. I photographed every screen, saved copies to a personal cloud drive, a second flash drive I'd brought from home, and an encrypted email to myself, 3 locations, 3 backups. Because I was my father's daughter, in at least one way, I knew how to plan for the moment someone tried to destroy the evidence. The cold desk surface pressed against my wrists as I leaned forward, clicking deeper into the folder, past the wire transfers, past the account summaries, into a subfolder labeled simply Authorization. What kind of father forges his daughter's signature on a document designed to send her to prison? What kind of family builds a trap out of the trust you gave them and files it away like an insurance policy against the day you stop being useful? The document was a single-page contract authorizing a transfer of $320,000 to one of the shell companies. It was dated 6 months ago. The authorization signature at the bottom was mine. Except I had never seen this document before in my life. I magnified the signature on the screen. The loops were right. The pressure points were right. The slight leftward lean I'd developed from years of signing construction permits at awkward angles on job sites. Whoever had done this had studied my handwriting with the patience of a forger and the intimacy of someone who had watched me sign birthday cards for decades. My hands had been steady through every offshore account, every shell company, every wire confirmation. They stopped being steady now. The tremor started in my right hand and moved to my left, and I gripped the edge of the desk until my knuckles went white, because I needed something solid to hold on to while the last piece of what I thought I knew about my family broke apart. They didn't just plan to cut me out. They built a frame, a prefabricated criminal case with my name on it, ready to deploy the moment I became a problem. The disinheritance wasn't the punishment. It was the mercy. This document was what waited behind it. I swallowed against a throat so tight it ached. My mouth was completely dry. The phone camera clicked in the silence. Once, twice, 3 times. Each shutter sound loud enough to echo off the empty cubicle walls. I saved the images, closed the subfolder, closed the main folder, and as the screen returned to the desktop, I saw one more detail I had missed. The document properties, metadata, the kind of information most people never think to check because most people don't build IT systems for a living. The forged authorization had been created on a machine logged in under a user account I recognized, not Boyd's, not an unknown name, not some hired specialist. Lorraine's, the woman who had kissed my forehead at every birthday, the woman who had laughed behind a closed door 2 nights ago and said I was never built for this family. She hadn't just agreed to cut me out. She had sat at a computer, studied my signature, and forged it onto a document designed to make me the fall person for her husband's crimes. I photographed the metadata. I stood up from the desk. The office was silent. The harbor lights sparkled through the windows like they always did, beautiful and indifferent. I walked to the elevator with my phone full of evidence and my chest full of something that had graduated past anger into a territory I didn't have a word for yet. Something cold, something patient, something that was just getting started. Lorraine had forged my signature. Not Boyd, Lorraine. The woman who braided my hair before school and packed notes in my lunchbox had sat at a keyboard and carefully replicated my handwriting onto a document designed to put me in prison. I drove to downtown Honolulu the next morning, carrying that knowledge like a stone in my chest. I needed someone outside that house to look at the evidence and tell me I wasn't losing my mind. Sabine Gallagher, 38, was a construction litigation attorney with a corner office overlooking Honolulu Harbor and a reputation for dismantling fraud cases the way other people dismantled furniture, methodically, without sentiment, and with full awareness of where the screws were hidden. She was also the closest thing I had to a best friend, which meant she had never once told me what I wanted to hear. I laid the dossier on her glass desk. Morning sun caught the edges of the documents. Sabine pulled the stack toward her, uncapped her pen, and began reading without a word. She went through the shell company invoices first, then the offshore wire confirmations, then the forged authorization with my signature. Her pen tapped the forgery twice, sharp, precise taps, before she set it down and looked at me. "This isn't a family dispute," she said. "This is federal wire fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. If you bring this to prosecutors, your father is looking at years. Federal wire fraud, conspiracy, premeditated entrapment. Those were the words my best friend used to describe what my parents had done. And she said them the way a surgeon describes what needs to come out. No emotion, no softening, just the clinical truth of a situation that had metastasized past the point of gentle language. "And the forged signature?" I asked. "That's not just fraud. That's premeditated entrapment of their own daughter." She picked up the printout again, studying the metadata I'd circled. "They built a trap. If you ever questioned the finances, they had a document ready to make you the fall person. Your name, your signature, your liability." The coffee she'd poured me was strong and black, leaving a bitter film on my tongue that matched the taste of everything I'd learned in the last 4 days. "The power of attorney is your shield right now," Sabine continued, leaning forward. "But the second Boyd files a revocation, that window closes. Whatever you still need to do under that authority, do it now, today if possible." I told her about Gil, about the flash drive, about the untraceable monthly payment neither of us could fully explain yet. Sabine listened, made notes, and told me to bring Gil in formally within the week. Then she walked me to the door and said the thing that stayed with me for the rest of the day. "You're not losing your mind. You're the only person in that family who found it." I drove back to Kailua with the dossier locked in my trunk and Sabine's words bracing me for whatever came next. What came next was Lorraine. She was waiting in the kitchen when I walked in. Jasmine drifted through the open window from the estate garden, and the afternoon light made the room look warm and safe. The kind of kitchen where families were supposed to talk things out over iced tea and good intentions. Lorraine had positioned herself at the counter with both hands wrapped around a mug, her posture open, her eyes soft. I recognized the choreography. She'd been rehearsing. Lorraine had always wielded softness like a blade. The gentler her voice, the deeper the cut she was preparing to make. "Sweetheart, I think we need to clear the air," she began. Her voice was pitched low, careful, the tone she used when she wanted you to feel like the unreasonable one before the conversation even started. "You've always had a tendency to overthink things. Remember when you were 16 and you were convinced your math teacher was grading you unfairly? You got so worked up and it turned out to be nothing." She smiled, patient, practiced. "Your father and I Just want what's best for this family. If you'd only come to us instead of going behind our backs, we could have explained everything. There are things about the company finances that look strange from the outside, but are perfectly. I didn't imagine the money, Mom. She blinked. The smile held, but the warmth behind it flickered. She called me sensitive. She called me anxious. She called me the girl who imagines problems. And then I told her the truth. And for the first time in 59 years, Lorraine Prescott had nothing to say. And I didn't imagine your login credentials on the document you forged with my signature. The granite counter stood between us like a border crossing. Lorraine's manicured fingers tightened around her mug. The color left her face in stages, cheeks first, then lips, then the careful composure she'd spent a lifetime building. She opened her mouth, closed it, set the mug down with a click that sounded like a period at the end of a very long sentence. She turned and walked out of the kitchen without another word. I stood there, in the jasmine-scented silence, and waited. 20 minutes later, Boyd's car pulled into the driveway. The engine cut, the door slammed. His footsteps crossed the foyer and headed straight for the study, heavy, urgent, the footsteps of a man who had just received a phone call from his wife. I heard the study door open, a pause, then the sound of a drawer being pulled, the drawer with the broken lock I hadn't bothered to fix. Boyd didn't come out of that study for 45 minutes. When he did, his face had the rigid composure of a man who had already called his lawyer and been told what I already knew. The transfer was done, the trust was independent, and no revocation form in the world could claw it back. How was waiting for me the next time I walked past the study door, pen in hand. A notarized revocation document already signed on his side, crisp and official, as if paperwork could undo what I'd done. "Sign this," he said, "now, before I call the police and have you arrested for theft." The bourbon glass on his desk was untouched. That told me more than his voice did. Boyd Prescott didn't leave bourbon unfinished unless he was too angry to swallow. I stepped inside the study. The mahogany desk gleamed under the lamp. The drawer with the broken lock was closed but not locked. There was nothing left to protect inside it. "The trust was created under legal authority you gave me," I said. "The funds are protected, not stolen, and your lawyer already knows that, which is why you're holding a pen instead of a phone." Boyd's hand tightened around the pen until his knuckles blanched. He set the revocation document on the desk and smoothed it flat with both palms, the way a man smooths out a plan that has already failed. Watching Boyd realize his own signature had built the cage he was now standing in was like watching a man drown in a pool he'd filled himself. Every authorization I'd used, every credential, every access point, he had given me all of it, out of convenience, out of arrogance, out of the unshakable belief that the adopted daughter he'd groomed to run his company would never turn the keys on him. "You think you've won?" he asked. His voice was low, controlled, the most dangerous register he had. "I think I've just started." I turned and walked out of the study. He didn't follow. The trade winds pushed through the hallway, carrying salt air from the coast, and I breathed it in like the first clean breath I'd taken in days. The next morning, I went to the Kaka'ako office early. Gil was already there. He met me in the hallway with his messenger bag tight against his side and a look on his face that I'd come to recognize. The look of a man who had found something he wished he hadn't. We sat at my desk with the door closed. The server room hummed through the wall. Gil laid 2 printouts side by side and pointed at a name that appeared on both. "How many fraud trails does it take before coincidence stops being a word you can use and conspiracy becomes the only one that fits?" "The offshore wire confirmations," Gil said, his voice low enough to stay under the air conditioning. "They route through a holding company called Coral Ridge Ventures. I traced the registration. It's owned by a man named Dwight Kemper. Dwight Kemper. I had never heard the name spoken aloud in the Prescott house, never seen it on any company org chart, never encountered it in a decade of managing projects. But Gil wasn't finished. That same name, he continued, sliding the second printout closer, appears on the records you photographed from Boyd's drawer, the silence payment ledger. Kemper's company is the intermediary. The money flows from Prescott Pacific through Coral Ridge Ventures and then out to the final recipient. I looked at both documents. The routing was different, the account numbers were different, but the name at the center was identical. Dwight Kemper, a name on paper only so far, registered as the sole owner of Coral Ridge Ventures and listed nowhere in the company's official records. Dwight Kemper, the same name on the offshore accounts, the same name on the silence payments, the same name connected to a dead woman on the Poly Highway, and a living father who had never once mentioned him in my presence. I drank lukewarm water from the office cooler and let the pieces settle. The fraud wasn't just Boyd skimming contracts. It was a system, built with a partner, sustained for years, and designed to fund two separate operations, the offshore theft and the payments that kept a woman on Maui quiet about how her sister died. Then whoever this man is, Gil said, gathering the printouts, he's connected to both the money leaving the company and the money keeping someone silent. Have you ever met him? Never. In 18 years, Boyd has never brought him to the office, never mentioned him in a meeting, never put his name on a single document I was supposed to see. Gil left. I sat at my desk with the office quiet around me and the sharp edges of those printouts still pressing against my fingertips. Then I did something I probably shouldn't have. I pulled up Boyd's contact list on the company's server, the address book he used for external partners, the one my admin access still reached. Kemper's entry was there, phone number, email, and a note beside the name, typed in a field Boyd probably assumed nobody else would ever read. Handle with care, knows everything. I stared at those two words, knows everything, and understood that whatever Dwight Kemper knew, it was worth more to Boyd than the millions he'd been paying to keep it contained. I spent the rest of that afternoon staring at two words on a screen, knows everything, and trying to map the shape of a conspiracy that now had a name, a routing number, and a man at its center I'd never heard of. Dwight Kemper was the hinge. Whatever Boyd was hiding, Kemper was the one holding the door closed. But that evening, someone else knocked on a different door entirely. Hadley came to me in the kitchen the way people come to hospital waiting rooms, not because they want to be there, but because they can't stand being anywhere else. The lights were low. The trade winds rattled the lanai shutters in a rhythm that sounded almost like breathing. She sat across from me at the counter with a mug of chamomile cradled between both palms and her eyes red-rimmed in the dim glow. She didn't start with a question. She started with a confession. "The night Dad told me about the inheritance," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "he didn't sit me down the way you sit a daughter down. He stood behind his desk. He had papers. He pointed to lines on a spreadsheet and told me what I was going to own and what I was going to do with it." She turned the mug in her hands. The faint scent of her shampoo reached me as she leaned closer. "He didn't give me the company like a gift. He handed it to me like a set of instructions, like I was supposed to guard it, not run it. There is a moment when someone you grew up competing against stops being your rival and starts being your witness. You realize the two of you were never enemies, just two daughters trapped in the same man's game, positioned against each other so neither of you would think to look at him. Is Dad who I think he is?" Hadley asked, "or have I been wrong about him my whole life?" The question sat between us on the granite counter like something fragile and sharp. I could have opened the entire file right there. The fraud, the forgery, the offshore accounts, the name Leilani Voss. But Hadley wasn't ready for all of it. Not yet. Not in a kitchen at 9 in the evening, with chamomile tea going cold, and the sound of Boyd's television drifting down the hall. "I think you already know the answer," I said. "I think that's why you're standing here." She didn't argue. She didn't defend him. She set the mug down, pressed her lips together, and nodded once. A small, tight nod that carried more weight than anything she'd ever said to me in 35 years of being sisters. Then she left, and I went to my room to prepare for what came next. I laid the evidence across my bedspread in the order I would present it. Invoices on the left, offshore wire confirmations in the center, the forged authorization on the right. Below them, the adoption certificate and the silence payment ledger. And at the bottom, printed from the company server that afternoon, Dwight Kemper's contact entry with Boyd's handwritten note. Laying out those documents felt like loading a weapon I never wanted to own. Each page was a round, each fact a calibration, and every one of them aimed at the people who raised me. I sat on the edge of the bed and began writing. A numbered list on a blank sheet of paper. Blue ink. No corrections. 7 items, organized in the exact sequence they needed to land, because the order was the weapon. Each truth making the next one impossible to deny. Item 1. The shell companies and inflated invoices. The domestic fraud, provable, documented, devastating on its own. Item 2. The offshore transfers. The second layer, deeper, larger, routed through Kemper's company. Item 3. The forged signature. The moment they would realize I knew they'd tried to frame me. Item 4. The power of attorney and the protected trust. The proof that I had already acted, already moved, already placed the company's liquid assets beyond their reach. Item 5. The adoption certificate. The lie that held everything together. Item 6. The silence payments. The money trail leading to a woman on Maui and a death 25 years old. I wrote 6 items in precise clinical order. The 7th I wrote slowly, pressing the pen hard enough to leave a groove in the paper beneath. One name. The name of a woman who never got to raise me. The name that, if spoken in Boyd's presence, would force a reaction no amount of rehearsed composure could contain. Leilani. I capped the pen. Set the list face down on my nightstand. The night jasmine drifted through my window, sweet and indifferent, the way Hawaii always smelled when the worst things were happening inside its houses. 7 items, 7 truths, 1 confrontation. But not yet. There was one more thing I needed before I could sit at that table and dismantle everything Boyd had built. I needed the voice of the woman who had been cashing those checks for a quarter century. I needed to know what she knew, what she'd been paid to forget, and whether the death of a 26-year-old woman on the Pali Highway was really the accident everyone had agreed to call it. I set my alarm for 6 in the morning and turned off the light. Tomorrow, before anything else, I would find Constance Voss. I found Constance Voss, the way you find anyone in the age of public records, with a name, a last known location, and the kind of patience that comes from knowing the answer matters more than the speed of finding it. My alarm had gone off at 6. By 7, I was at the Kaka'ako office with the old newspaper article open on my monitor and the silence payment ledger pulled up beside it. Before the confrontation, I needed one thing no document could give me, the voice of someone who had known my mother while she was still alive. The article was 3 paragraphs long, a grainy photo of the Pali Highway crash site taken in daylight hours after the accident. The text was clinical, time of impact, road conditions, the name of the driver, And at the bottom, a single sentence: the victim was survived by one family member, a sister, Constance Voss, who was briefly interviewed by police. I typed the name into a public records database. The search returned 7 results statewide. I filtered by age range and last known address. One entry matched: a 58-year-old woman living in Paia on the north shore of Maui, a retired county records clerk. Current address listed since 2004. One island away, 30 minutes by plane. My biological aunt had been living close enough to see the same sunset I watched every evening, and for 25 years, a monthly check had been the price of making sure I never knew she existed. I sat with that for a long time. The office was empty around me. Salt air drifted through a cracked window from the Kaka'ako waterfront, mixing with the warm hum of printer toner and recycled air. The afternoon sun cut across my desk in a slow diagonal, and I watched it move while I decided what to do with the phone number glowing on my screen. I had rehearsed what to say a dozen times in my head during the drive that morning. I had not rehearsed how it would feel to dial the number of someone who shared blood with the woman who gave birth to me, someone who had been paid to pretend I didn't exist. I picked up my phone, pressed the number, listened to it ring, once, twice, 3 times, 4. A woman answered. Her voice was cautious, the way people answer calls from numbers they don't recognize, guarded, a half step back from the receiver, ready to hang up. Hello? My name is Keira, I said. The words came out steadier than I felt. I was adopted by Boyd Prescott when I was 3 years old. I think your sister was my mother. Silence. Not the silence of someone who doesn't understand. The silence of someone who has understood for 25 years and is hearing the thing she always knew would come. 5 seconds, maybe 6, long enough for me to press the phone harder against my ear and grip the edge of my desk with my free hand until the wood grain bit into my fingers. Then a sound, small, involuntary, the kind of sound that escapes before a person can catch it, a breath that was almost a word, and then the word itself. Keira, Constance Voss, 58 years old, a retired county records clerk who had spent a quarter-century cashing checks and keeping a promise she never should have been asked to make, said my name like it was something she'd been holding in her mouth for decades, careful, fragile, full of a grief I could feel through the phone line. What do you say to the woman who lost her sister, took the money, kept the silence, and still waited by the phone for a niece she was never supposed to meet? I didn't have an answer, so I said the only true thing I had. I found out I was adopted 6 days ago. I found your name in a file my father kept locked in his desk. I don't know the full story yet, but I know someone has been paying you to stay away from me, and I need to understand why. Another pause, shorter this time. When Constance spoke again, her voice had changed, still cracked, still trembling, but underneath it was something solid, relief, the particular relief of a woman who had been carrying a weight alone and just heard footsteps coming up the road. I've been waiting for this call for a very long time, she said. Can you come to Maui? Yes. Soon? As soon as I can. The salt sting at the back of my throat surprised me. I wasn't crying, not quite, but something behind my eyes was pressing forward, and I swallowed against it hard enough that she must have heard. We talked for 3 more minutes. Practical things, her address, which I already had, and the best time to come, which was any time, she said, because she'd been ready for years. Then, just before we hung up, Constance said one more thing. Quiet. Almost to herself, as if she were deciding in real time whether to say it. There are things I need to tell you that I've never told anyone. Things about the night your mother died. A pause. The trade winds pushed through the cracked office window, carrying the smell of the harbor. But not on the phone, Come to Paya. Come soon. She hung up. I set my phone on the desk and sat in the empty office, listening to the silence she left behind, a silence that was no longer paid for. 2 days later, I was on a prop plane to Maui with nothing but a carry-on bag and a list of questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. The flight was 30 minutes. I spent every one of them staring out the window at the channel between the islands, watching the water shift from deep blue to turquoise to the foaming white line where the waves broke against Maui's north shore. Somewhere down there, in a town called Paya, a woman who shared my blood was waiting to tell me how my mother died. Constance Voss's cottage sat at the end of a crushed shell road lined with plumeria trees. It was small and weathered, the kind of house that looks like it grew out of the land rather than being built on it. Sun-bleached siding, a corrugated tin roof spotted with rust, a porch railing wrapped in bougainvillea, so thick it looked like the flowers were holding the house together. She was sitting on the porch when I pulled up in the rental car. 58 years old, sun-weathered face, silver hair pulled back in a clip. She stood when she saw me, and her hands went to her mouth, and she stayed like that, frozen, looking at me through the windshield, until I opened the car door and stepped out. "You look like her," she said. Her voice cracked on the second word. "God help me, you look exactly like her." I had prepared for this moment the way I prepare for everything, with research, with questions, with a plan. None of it survived the first 10 seconds of standing in front of a woman who was looking at my face and seeing her dead sister. There are introductions that happen with handshakes, and there are introductions that happen with silence. Ours was the second kind. We stood on that porch with the plumeria scent thick between us and the sound of the ocean somewhere behind the trees, and neither of us spoke for what felt like a full minute. Then Constance reached out and touched my cheek, just once, just her fingertips, and whispered something I couldn't quite hear. She led me inside. The cottage was small, a kitchen, a sitting room, a hallway leading to 2 bedrooms. The walls were covered in photographs I couldn't look at yet. The kitchen table was scratched koa wood, and she'd set out 2 cups of tea that had already gone lukewarm. "I don't know where to start," she said, sitting across from me. Her hands were wrapped around her mug the way they'd been wrapped around the phone 2 days ago, holding on. "Start wherever you need to." I need to start with an apology. I hadn't expected that. I'd expected a story, an explanation, maybe a defense. But Constance Voss started by telling me she was sorry. Sorry for taking the money. Sorry for keeping quiet. Sorry for letting fear do what 25 years of conscience couldn't undo. She told me the payments began 3 weeks after Leilani's funeral. At first, she believed they were guilt money, Boyd feeling responsible because her sister had been working late at his company the night she died. But the conditions came quickly. No contact with the Prescott family, no public statements, no visits to Oahu without notice. A letter from Boyd's attorney arriving every January reminding her that the arrangement was contingent on continued discretion. "I told myself it was for you," Constance said. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady now, the steadiness of someone who had crossed a threshold and couldn't go back. "I told myself that if I stayed away, at least you'd grow up in a good home with good people. I didn't know what kind of people they really were. Not then." A rain squall hit the tin roof without warning, sudden, percussive, loud enough to rattle the cups on the table. Constance didn't flinch. I did. The rain sealed the cottage off from the world, turning it into something between a confessional and a bunker, and Constance spoke under the downpour with her voice barely above a whisper. She told me about the photographs on the walls. Most of them were Leilani. She told me about the letters she'd written to Boyd over the years, angry letters she never sent, stacked in a shoebox in the bedroom closet. She told me she'd tried to return the money 7 times and been refused each time. And then she told me she needed to stop for today. That the rest, the part about the night Leilani died, she wasn't ready to say yet. Not because she didn't want to, but because once she said it, there was no taking it back. I need to tell you everything, she said, walking me to the door as the rain thinned to mist. But I need one more day. Can you come back tomorrow? I told her I could. I told her I would stay on the island as long as she needed. Before I stepped off the porch, Constance grabbed my wrist. Not hard, but firm. Papery skin, surprising strength. There are things about the night your mother died that I've never told anyone, she said. Not the police, not the lawyers, no one. The rain had stopped. The plumeria dripped. Somewhere behind the cottage, the ocean exhaled against the rocks. But not today, she whispered. Come back tomorrow. Come early. I drove back to the hotel with her fingerprints still warm on my wrist and a question I couldn't shake. If Constance had kept this secret for 25 years, what could possibly be bad enough that she needed another day to find the words? I came back the next morning. Constance opened the door with tea sloshing over her shaking hands, and she didn't greet me or apologize for the spill. She just said, "Sit down before I lose my nerve." I sat. The koa wood table was the same. The plumeria smell was the same, but Constance was different. Whatever she'd spent the night preparing to tell me had changed the shape of her face, drawn it tighter, made her eyes harder. She moved to the bedroom before I could say a word and came back carrying a shoebox. She didn't ease into it. She tore the lid off and fanned the contents across the table like a dealer spreading cards, bank statements, wire transfer confirmations, envelopes with return addresses I didn't recognize. 25 years of paper, yellowed at the edges, smelling of old ink and something close to grief. Every month for 25 years, Constance said. Her voice was low and flat, the voice of someone reciting something she'd memorized. 3 weeks after they buried my sister, the first wire hit my account. $4,200, same amount every month, never missed, never late. She pointed to the routing information on the earliest statement. The transfers came through a company I'd never seen in Prescott Pacific's official records, Pacific Horizon Holdings. A different shell from the ones Gil had found, but the architecture was the same. Offshore routing, no public registration, no traceable employees. His lawyer sent a letter with the first payment. Constance continued, "Keep quiet. Stay away from the family. Don't contact the child, and the money keeps coming." Constance's hands stopped shaking. The sudden steadiness was worse than the trembling. It meant she'd crossed some internal threshold. She was no longer nervous. She was resolute. I kept every statement. I kept every letter. I wrote him back dozens of times. Angry letters, begging letters, threatening letters. She nudged a stack of unsealed envelopes. I never sent a single one. I stared at the table. Over $1 million, spread across a quarter century, paid through a shell company to buy the silence of a dead woman's sister. I picked up one of the wire confirmations and read the memo line. It said, "Monthly support," the way a tourniquet says bandage. I stared at 25 years of wire transfers, laid out on a kitchen table in Maui, and I understood something that turned my stomach. Boyd hadn't been generous to Constance. He'd been buying her silence. The only question left was, silence about what? Her, mid-story, CTA. Before I tell you what Constance said next, are you still with me? Drop your guess in one sentence. What do you think Boyd was really paying to keep buried? Because what comes next rewrites the whole story. Please note, the next part contains some recreated details for narrative purposes. The message is what I hope stays with you. Mid-story, CTA. Constance didn't answer right away. She stood up, walked to the kitchen window, and looked out at the ocean, like she was measuring how much truth she could survive telling. A rain squall hit the tin roof like a fist, sudden and violent, sealing the cottage into a confessional neither of us could leave. Constance spoke under the downpour, her voice barely audible above the hammering. "The night your mother died," she said. "She called me at 9:47. I know the exact time because I looked at the clock when the phone rang. She was crying." Constance turned from the window. Her eyes were dry. She said she'd found something in the company's financial records, something Boyd couldn't explain. Payments to people who didn't exist for work that was never done. She said she was going to confront him. I begged her not to go back to that office. I told her to wait, to call a lawyer, to do anything except walk into that building alone at night. Her voice dropped. The line went dead. By midnight, 2 officers were at my door. A memory surfaced, something I hadn't thought about in years. My grandfather, Orrin, his hand on my shoulder when I was 10 or 11, saying quietly, "Your mother was the bravest woman I ever knew." I had always thought he meant Lorraine. I had always thought he meant brave in the way mothers are brave, patient, enduring, soft. Now I understood he may have meant something else entirely. He may have meant the kind of brave that gets you killed. "The police ruled it an accident," Constance said. "Wet road, sharp curve, no other vehicles. They never investigated further. They never asked why a 26-year-old woman was driving alone on the Poly Highway at 10:30 on a Tuesday night after calling her sister in tears." She looked at me across that table, covered in paper and silence, and 25 years of money that was never really about support. "Your mother didn't die in an accident," Constance said. "She died because she found something she wasn't supposed to find." The rain hammered the roof. The tea sat cold between us, and everything I thought I knew about the family that raised me collapsed into something I couldn't rebuild. Constance walked me to the door as the rain thinned to mist. Before I stepped off the porch, she grabbed my wrist, papery skin, surprising strength. "One more thing. A month before she died, your mother mailed me a package, told me not to open it unless something happened to her." She disappeared into the back room and returned holding a small, water-stained padded envelope, still sealed, yellowed at the edges, 25 years old. "I think it's time," she said. My thumbnail split the brittle seal. The envelope cracked open like something that had been holding its breath for 25 years, and the first thing that fell onto the koa wood table was a photograph I had never seen. A woman holding a newborn, dark hair, tired eyes, a smile so wide it changed the shape of her whole face. And beside her, one arm around both of them, looking younger and softer than I had ever known him to be, Boyd. I held the photograph by its curled edges and stared at a version of my father that no longer existed, a man who had once put his arm around my mother and me and let someone take a picture, a man who had looked at both of us like we mattered. Constance sat across from me, quiet, letting the photograph do its work. The smell of aged paper and envelope glue mixed with the ginger tea she'd brewed, and the wind pushed through the louvered windows carrying salt and plumeria, and the sound of a world that had no idea what was unfolding inside this cottage. 2 more items had fallen from the envelope. A handwritten letter, 2 pages, cramped script, blue ink on lined paper, and 3 photocopied pages from what I recognized immediately as Prescott Pacific's internal ledger, marked in the margins with annotations in the same handwriting. "She wrote that letter the week before she died," Constance said. "Read the last line." I was reading my dead mother's handwriting for the first time in my life. The loops, the slant, the way she pressed harder on downstrokes. It looked exactly like mine. The same hand, the same pressure. 37 years apart, and our penmanship was identical. The letter was addressed to Constance. It explained what Leilani had found: contract overcharges funneled through a holding company, money disappearing into accounts that didn't correspond to any real work. She had confronted Boyd. She had told him to acknowledge me publicly, or she would take the ledger pages to the authorities. The last line was written in ink that was slightly darker, as if she'd come back to add it later. "If you're opening this, Mom, then he did what I was afraid he'd do." I set the letter down. Salt stung my lips, and I realized I was crying. Not the kind of crying that announces itself, but the quiet kind that starts without permission and doesn't stop when you notice it. "Your mother knew," Constance said. Her voice cracked on the word knew. She knew, and she went back to that office anyway. Constance filled in what the letter couldn't. Leilani had confronted Boyd at the Prescott Pacific office that evening. She'd laid out what she'd found and given him a choice: claim his daughter openly or face exposure. Then she'd called Constance from the car. She said he didn't yell, Constance told me, her eyes fixed on the table. He just smiled and told her to drive safe. She paused. That scared her more than anything. How do you mourn someone twice? Once for their death, the version you were told, the accident, the wet road, the sharp curve, and once for the truth about how they died, the phone call, the confrontation, the smile that was not a smile, and the 40 minutes between a dead phone line and 2 officers at your aunt's door. The police had ruled it driver fatigue. No independent investigation, no follow-up. A 26-year-old woman dead on the Poly Highway, and the case was closed before the week was out. "Why didn't you go to the police?" I asked. Constance looked at me with the patience of someone who had asked herself that question every day for a quarter century. With what? A feeling? A phone call with no recording? He owned half the contracts on this island. His name was on buildings. Mine was on a county clerk's retirement badge. She reached into the shoebox and pulled out one more stack. The original bank receipts, numbered sequentially. Boyd's accountant had filed the hush payments with the same precision as payroll. Neat. Orderly. 21 days after the funeral, the first wire landed. Not even a month. I picked up the ledger pages Leilani had annotated. Her notes in the margins matched what I'd found in Boyd's server. The same inflated contracts, the same phantom vendors, the same money flowing offshore. 25 years apart, mother and daughter had found the same fraud. The only difference was that she'd confronted him alone, and I hadn't. I gathered the photograph, the letter, and the ledger pages. I slid them into my bag with hands that were no longer shaking. Something had changed in the time it took to read my mother's last written words. The grief was still there, but it had been joined by something harder, something with edges. "I'm not going to the police," I told Constance. "Not yet. I'm going to finish what she started, from inside the company." Constance nodded. She didn't argue. She understood. I stood, hugged her without a word, and walked to the rental car. The drive to the airport took 20 minutes. I called Sabine from the highway with the windows down and the Maui coastline disappearing behind me. "I have the proof." A breath on the other end. Then Sabine's voice, low and urgent. "Don't go home tonight." I ignored Sabine's warning. I went home anyway. Not because I was brave, but because I was done hiding in a house that was mine as much as it was his, and because the evidence was already secured at Sabine's office downtown. Boyd could threaten me all he wanted. The documents were beyond his reach. I was standing in the foyer when I walked through the door. The vein in his temple was pulsing, and the bourbon on his breath reached me before his voice did. You went to Maui, he said, not a question. I did. You went behind my back to dig up a woman I've been supporting out of charity for 25 years. I set my bag down on the entry table. The strap had been cutting into my shoulder for hours, the weight of everything inside it, pressing a groove into my skin that I knew would still be there in the morning. Charity doesn't come with silence clauses, Boyd. His jaw tightened. He took a step forward, close enough that I could see the broken capillaries in his eyes and smell the leather of his shoes on the marble floor. This was the Boyd Prescott who had built an empire through intimidation, the man who filled rooms with his presence, the way weather fills a valley, all pressure and no escape. But his fury filled that foyer like a pressure system with no direction, all force, no target, because the target had already moved. The evidence was with Sabine, the trust was irreversible, and the woman standing in front of him was no longer the grateful daughter who flinched when he raised his voice. I will have a restraining order filed by morning, he said, against you and against that woman on Maui, and I will have your access to every Prescott Pacific system revoked before you can. You already revoked my system access, Boyd. 3 days ago, Gil told me. I picked up my bag, and I don't need to beat you. I just need the truth, and I have it. I walked past him and up the stairs. He didn't follow. The adrenaline left a metallic taste on my tongue that lingered until I brushed my teeth an hour later. The next morning, Gil's text arrived at 7:15. 3 sentences, no punctuation, typed fast. They know I helped you, told me to clean out my desk by Friday. Keycard already deactivated. Gil's office keycard had already been deactivated. They didn't even wait until Friday. Boyd's people had moved overnight, locking Gil out of every system, every file, every door in the building. 18 years of service ended with a red light on a card reader. I met him at the Kaka'ako office an hour later. He was standing outside the building because he couldn't get in, his messenger bag over his shoulder, his face calm in the way that only truly stubborn people manage when the world is trying to bend them. I made copies before they locked my access, he said. Everything's in the lockbox. They're not getting rid of this that easy. If they fire you, it's retaliation. Sabine will make sure everyone knows it. Gil nodded once. We stood in the morning sun outside the building where we'd both spent the best years of our careers, and neither of us said what we both knew, that the company we'd built together was being hollowed out by the man whose name was on the door, and the only people trying to save it were the ones being pushed out. That evening, I found Hadley in the kitchen. The Koki frogs had started their nightly chorus outside, and the sound drifted through the open windows like a heartbeat the island couldn't turn off. I didn't ambush her. I didn't lecture. I pulled 3 pages from my bag, select pages from the annotated ledger, the ones with the clearest notations, and set them on the counter between us. I'm not showing you this to hurt you, I said. I'm showing you so you know what you're defending. Hadley picked up the first page. Her fingers trembled against the paper. She read it slowly, her eyes tracking the columns, the annotations, the numbers that didn't add up, then the second page, then the third. Hadley looked at those ledger pages the way someone looks at a crack in a foundation, knowing that if it's real, everything above it is compromised. Every room, every wall, every memory of feeling safe inside. This can't be real, she said. He wouldn't. She stopped herself mid-sentence, because she knew. The same way I had known in the hallway outside that study door, not because the evidence proved it, but because some part of her had always suspected and had spent her whole life choosing not to look. What are you going to do next? She asked. Her voice was barely steady, but the question wasn't hostile. It was genuine. The first question Hadley had ever asked me that wasn't filtered through Boyd's expectations or Lorraine's choreography. Before I could answer, Hadley set the pages down, walked to the window, and pressed her forehead against the cool glass. She stood there for a long time, the coqui frogs filling the silence between us. When she turned back, her expression had changed, not softer, decided. "There's something you should know," she said. "Dad called his lawyer tonight, not the business one, the criminal one." Boyd calling a criminal defense attorney meant one thing. He was no longer trying to win. He was trying to survive. I called Sabine that night and told her what Hadley had said. Her response was immediate. "We move tomorrow, before Boyd has time to build a wall between himself and the evidence." So the next evening, I set 4 chairs in a square in the living room. No head of the table, no advantage. I positioned them with the precision of someone staging a scene she'd been rehearsing for 12 days, and then I sat down with a folder on my lap and waited to see who would sit first. Hadley came in at 7. She looked at the chairs, looked at me, and sat without a word. She knew something was coming. She didn't know how much. Lorraine arrived 2 minutes later, confused by the arrangement, her perfume layered over the estate's ever-present wood polish. She chose the chair closest to the hallway, nearest the exit, I noticed, though she probably didn't realize that's why she chose it. "What is this about?" she asked. I didn't answer. I was waiting for Boyd. He came in last. Leather shoes on hardwood, unhurried, the walk of a man who believed that arriving last was a form of authority. He looked at the 4 chairs arranged in their careful square and almost smiled, the smile of someone who finds a child's attempt at seriousness amusing. He sat down. The lamplight caught the buttons on his jacket. "I asked you here because every person in this room has been living inside a lie," I said. My voice was steady. The ghost of the coffee I'd drunk an hour ago sat bitter at the back of my throat. "Some of you built it. Some of you just moved in." Lorraine shifted in her chair. "Whatever this is about, we can discuss it privately." "We've had 25 years of privately. That's the problem." Lorraine reached for Boyd's hand under the armrest. He pulled away without looking at her. A small gesture, reflexive, automatic, but it said everything about where his loyalties ended when the pressure started. Lorraine's hand hung in the air for a half second before she withdrew it to her own lap. Nobody mentioned it. Everybody saw it. I opened by laying out the structure of the evening. I told them I had evidence of financial irregularities inside Prescott Pacific. I told them the evidence had been reviewed by an attorney and was being held in a secure location outside this house. I told them nothing I was about to share was speculation. Every claim had documentation. Boyd listened. He sat with one ankle crossed over his knee and his arms folded, his body language broadcasting a single message: "This is beneath me." When I finished my preamble, he uncrossed his leg and leaned forward. "You think some papers can undo 30 years of this family?" he said. "Of this company? You're swinging at ghosts." When did Boyd stop being a father and start being a defendant, rehearsing his closing argument? I watched him speak and saw the performance for what it was, not confidence but containment. Every word was chosen to sound dismissive while buying time. Every gesture was designed to make the room feel like his, even as the ground beneath him shifted. "Go ahead," he continued. "Take your little folder to whoever you want. See how far you get without the Prescott name backing you up." He glanced at Hadley. The glance was a command, the kind of look he'd been giving her since she was old enough to understand that being the favored daughter came with obligations. "Tell your sister to stop embarrassing herself." Boyd's voice filled the room the way concrete fills a mold, heavy, deliberate, designed to set into something permanent. He expected the room to harden around his words the way it always had. He expected Lorraine to nod. He expected Hadley to comply. Hadley didn't move. She didn't speak. She sat in her chair with her hands flat on her knees and looked straight ahead at a point somewhere between me and the wall, and the silence that came from her was louder than anything Boyd had said. Boyd noticed. His contempt flickered, just for a second, just enough for me to see it, into something sharper, not anger, recognition. The recognition that his biological daughter, the one he'd groomed to guard his empire, had just refused a direct order in front of the entire family. He stood up, buttoned his jacket, walked toward the door as if the meeting was over, as if leaving the room meant leaving the conversation, as if 30 years of walking away from uncomfortable truths had built a muscle memory he could rely on one more time. "I wasn't finished," I said. "Sit down." He turned. His hand was on the doorframe. The clock on the mantel ticked once in the silence, a single, precise beat that sounded like a period at the end of everything that had come before. Nobody in this house had ever spoken to Boyd Prescott like that. Not Lorraine, not Hadley, not the employees, not the contractors, not the lawyers who billed him $400 an hour to tell him what he wanted to hear. I didn't sit, but he didn't leave. He stood in the doorway with his hand on the frame and his jaw tight, and I opened the folder on my lap. I pulled the first page from the folder and slid it across the table face up, angled so Boyd could read it from where he stood in the doorway. He didn't move toward it. He didn't need to. The numbers were large enough to read from 6 feet away. I started with the most recent invoice and worked backward. Reverse chronological order, each document older than the last, each one proving I'd been tracking him longer than he realized. The first page was an inflated contract from 3 months ago. The second was from 6 months before that. By the fourth document, Boyd's jaw had tightened in a way that told me he was doing math in his head, calculating exactly how far back my evidence reached. Invoice 4417, I said, laying the next page down. Billed at $340,000 for materials that cost $120. The difference went here. I tapped the offshore wire transfer record beside it. Through a shell company to an account registered under your initials. Page after page hit the dark wood table. Inflated contracts. Duplicate vendor payments to companies that existed only as post office boxes. Wire confirmations routed through Coral Ridge Ventures. And the name that connected all of it, a business partner Boyd had never once mentioned in my presence. Lorraine's hand moved halfway toward the documents and froze. She'd seen the offshore account number on one of the transfer records, and something in her face changed. A flicker of recognition that she tried to hide and couldn't. She knew that number. She'd seen it before. And she hadn't been told about it tonight. I kept going. "Enough," Lorraine said, standing abruptly. Her chair scraped against the hardwood. "This is your father's company, not a courtroom. If there are accounting issues, they can be handled by—" "Sit down, Lorraine. I'm not done, and neither is he." She sat. Not because I had authority over her, but because the documents on that table had already taken it from everyone in the room. Boyd hadn't spoken. He stood in the doorway with his arms folded, watching me lay out the architecture of his fraud, the way you watch someone disassemble a machine you built, with the grim fascination of a man who knows exactly how each piece connects because he installed them himself. I saved the last document. I'd kept it at the bottom of the folder, beneath everything else, because the sequence mattered. The fraud was devastating, but this was personal. I pulled it out and held it up so everyone could see. Let me tell you what silence sounds like when it comes from a man who has spent 30 years filling every room he enters with his voice. It sounds like the air going out of a tire, slow, irreversible, the room deflating around a man who has run out of pressure. "This is my signature," I said, holding the document toward the light. Except I never signed it. Someone forged it to make me liable for everything in that offshore account. I set it on the table. The old paper and printer ink smell mixed with the estate's cedar air, and for a moment, the only sound was the clock on the mantel ticking into a silence that nobody could fill. You didn't just steal from the company, Boyd. You set me up to take the fall. Boyd's mouth opened. Nothing came out. His lips moved the way they do when the brain is sending words, but the body refuses to deliver them. For the first time in my entire life, in every argument, every boardroom, every dinner table disagreement, Boyd Prescott had nothing to say. "Dad?" Hadley's voice was barely audible. A whisper aimed at the man in the doorway, asking a question that contained every other question she'd ever been afraid to ask. Hadley looked at the forged signature, then at her father, and I watched the exact moment my sister stopped being Boyd's daughter and started being a witness. Her eyes moved between the document and his face, the way you check a lock twice, not because you doubt the first look, but because you need the repetition to make it real. Bile rose in my throat, the taste of my own name weaponized against me, forged, backdated, filed away like insurance against the day I stopped being useful. I swallowed it down and kept my hand flat on the document, pressing it against the polished grain of the table. Boyd moved, not to speak, not to defend himself. He reached for the forged signature, not to examine it, but to take it off the table, to remove it from the room, to make it disappear the way he had made everything inconvenient disappear for 30 years. My hand came down on it first. "That stays." His fingers were inches from mine. We held the position for 2 full seconds, his hand reaching, mine pressing, and then he withdrew, slowly, the way a man withdraws from a fire he didn't expect to be hot. The room hung suspended, Boyd standing, Lorraine sitting with her hands in her lap, knuckles blanched white, Hadley motionless, me with my palm on the document that proved the people who raised me had built a prison with my name on the door. Then Lorraine spoke. From across the room, her voice stripped of every pretense, every performance, every layer of warmth she'd spent 59 years perfecting. "Boyd, did you know about her mother?" Lorraine's question hung in the room like a blade waiting to fall. Boyd looked at his wife, and for the first time tonight, I saw something cross his face that wasn't anger or contempt. It was calculation, the rapid animal math of a man deciding whether truth or another lie would serve him better in the next 30 seconds. He chose wrong. He chose silence, and I filled it. I reached past the fraud documents and placed one final page on the table, older than the rest, creased from years in a filing cabinet, the paper soft at the folds, the ink slightly faded, my adoption certificate, the oldest document on that table, older than every invoice, every wire transfer, every forged signature, proof that Boyd's deception didn't start with the money. It started with me. 25 years, I said, my nails pressed crescents into my palms. Every birthday, every holiday, every time you called me your daughter and watched me believe it. Nobody in this room thought I deserved the truth. Hadley stared at the certificate. I watched her read it, the date, the names, the agency stamp, and I watched her look up at me with an expression I will never forget. Not shock, recalculation. The machinery behind her eyes was rebuilding everything she thought she knew about our family, restructuring every memory, every assumption, every moment she'd believed we were sisters in the way that word is supposed to mean. Lorraine broke, not the way she broke earlier, the controlled performance, the rehearsed protest. This was real. She covered her face with both hands and began crying, her shoulders shaking, mascara tracking down her cheeks in dark lines that aged her 10 years in 10 seconds. The sound was stifled, private, the kind of crying that comes from shame rather than grief. Lorraine's tears weren't for me. They were for herself, for the version of this family she had spent 25 years convincing herself was real, for the lie she had maintained so carefully that she forgot it was a lie, until a creased piece of paper on a table made it impossible to forget. "We were trying to protect you," she said through her hands. "You have to believe that." "Protect me?" I said. "Or protect the story you built around me?" She didn't answer. The stale air of the room, sealed for hours, no one had thought to open a window, pressed in on all of us like a confession booth running out of oxygen. Boyd had moved back into the room during the adoption reveal. He stood near the corner now, away from the door, his retreat cut off by the weight of what was on the table. His hands were shaking. I noticed it the way you notice a crack in concrete. Suddenly, completely, with the understanding that it's been spreading for a long time. His hands were shaking, the same way Constance's hands had shaken 2 days ago in Paya. Fear looks the same on everyone. The powerful and the powerless, the man who built the cage and the woman who lived inside it. "This is insane," Boyd said. His voice was different now, thinner. The baritone authority had cracked, and what came through the fissure was something reedy and desperate. "You're taking a few documents and constructing some kind of, I did what I did for this family. Everything I did was to keep this family together." "Including paying Constance?" I asked. The name landed in the room like a stone in still water. Boyd flinched. Lorraine lowered her hands from her face. Hadley turned toward her father. "I paid Constance to keep quiet, because if anyone found out how Leilani died, what happened that night, this family, this company, everything would have—" He stopped. The words left his mouth like a door, swinging open, that could never be closed again. Everyone in the room heard the hinge break. Boyd's face went white as his own sentence caught up with him, the sentence he hadn't meant to say, the connection he'd spent 25 years keeping separate, the silence payments, and the death linked in his own voice for the first time. "Finish the sentence, Boyd," I said. I bit the inside of my cheek hard enough to taste copper. My voice was steady. My hands were not. I didn't finish it. He stood in the corner of the living room with his mouth open and his hands trembling, and the ruins of his authority scattered across a table in the form of documents he couldn't destroy and words he couldn't take back. Hadley spoke first. She turned slowly toward Boyd, and her voice was barely above a whisper. But in the silence of that room, it carried like a gunshot. "Dad, what did you just say?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Boyd looked at Hadley, then at me, then at the door, not the way a man looks at an exit, but the way a man looks at a possibility he's already lost. For the first time tonight, I saw him calculate whether he could still run. He couldn't. The evidence was on the table. His words were in the air. His daughter was staring at him with the expression of someone who has just watched a building she lived in begin to collapse. Lorraine stood, slowly, mascara streaking her face, her hands still trembling, but something in her posture had changed. She wasn't leaning toward Boyd anymore. She was standing on her own. "Tell them," she said. "Tell them everything, or I will." Boyd opened his mouth to answer Lorraine's ultimatum. But before he could speak, Hadley moved. She pushed her chair back with a scrape that cut through the room like a starting gun, and she stood up. She didn't look at Boyd. She didn't look at Lorraine. She crossed the living room in 4 steps, and when she reached me, she took my hand. Her grip was warm. My fingers were cold. I hadn't realized how cold until her palm wrapped around them. She held on the way you hold someone at the edge of a cliff, not gently but completely, and she said the words I had spent 12 days earning. "From now on, you're not alone. I should have said that years ago. Boyd's voice came from across the room, hoarse and rising. Hadley, Hadley, sit down. You don't know what you're doing. She didn't turn. She kept her eyes on me, and when she answered him, her voice was the steadiest thing in the room. I know exactly what I'm doing for the first time. Boyd said her name again, twice, each time thinner than the last, the authority draining from his voice the way water drains from a cracked vessel, fast at first, then in a slow, irreversible trickle. His biological daughter, the one he had chosen, the one he had shaped and positioned and handed the company to like a set of instructions, had just walked across the room and taken the hand of the sister he'd thrown away. I squeezed Hadley's hand, and something I had carried since childhood released from my chest. The weight of performing gratitude, of smiling at birthday dinners, and saying thank you for a life built on a foundation I was never supposed to see, lifted like a breath I'd been holding for 25 years, not gone, but finally exhaled. Lorraine watched it happen. She watched her biological daughter choose her adopted sister, and whatever was left of the family's facade collapsed behind her eyes. She didn't speak. She didn't move to stop it. Boyd reached for Lorraine, a reflexive gesture, the habit of a man accustomed to forming alliances in a crisis. She stepped away, the second Prescott woman to leave his side in 5 minutes. He stood in the corner of his own living room with his hand extended toward a wife who had moved beyond his reach, and for the first time, Boyd Prescott looked like what he was, a man standing alone in the wreckage of something he had built and destroyed with the same hands. I let go of Hadley's hand and turned to the table. The documents were still spread across the dark wood, invoices, wire transfers, the forged signature, the adoption certificate. I gathered them one at a time, stacking them in the order I'd laid them out, with the precision of someone building a case and dismantling a house at the same time. The folder was heavy when I pressed it against my ribs, the weight of evidence, the weight of proof, the weight of a mother I never knew, and a truth that had been buried under monthly payments and sealed envelopes, and the practiced silence of people who called themselves family. I'm not doing this to destroy you, I said. I wasn't looking at Boyd. I was looking at the table where the documents had been, the empty space they'd left behind, the polished grain visible again, like a wound cleaned and exposed. I'm doing this because my mother deserved better than a lie and a check every month. I turned toward the door. Hadley moved with me. You'll hear from Sabine Gallagher's office by morning, I said. Everything goes to the federal prosecutor. Boyd's voice followed me, hoarse, stripped of everything except the last reflex of a man who had spent 62 years believing that threats were a form of communication. If you walk out that door, I stopped, turned, looked at him, really looked, the way I hadn't allowed myself to look in 12 days of evidence and rage and grief. I was 62 years old, and he looked every year of it. His hands were trembling. His jacket was unbuttoned. The bourbon glass in the study was probably still untouched. What? I said. You'll disown me again? The line landed in the room and stayed there. Boyd had no answer because there was no answer. The worst thing he could do to me, he had already done. The leverage was gone. The threats were empty. The door was open. I walked through it. The night air hit my face like water, clean, jasmine-scented, the first fresh breath after hours sealed in that stale room. It tasted like surfacing. Hadley was beside me, her footsteps matching mine on the gravel driveway, and neither of us spoke because some moments don't need words. They need distance. The estate lights threw our shadows long across the gravel, two figures walking away from a house that had stopped being home the moment I heard my name through a study door 12 days ago. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out without breaking stride. A text from Sabine. Federal prosecutor agreed to a meeting. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. Bring everything. I slid the phone back into my pocket. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes. Hadley walked beside me, the folder pressed against my ribs. I didn't look back. The meeting with the federal prosecutor happened 3 days later. Sabine had spent those 3 days organizing the evidence into a presentation so clean it could have been submitted as a textbook case study. Hadley and I stayed at a hotel in Waikiki. Neither of us went back to the estate. 3 days after walking out of that house, I sat across from a federal investigator in Sabine's conference room and slid a folder across the polished table. It weighed less than 2 pounds. It contained 25 years of crimes. The investigator was a composed man in his 50s named Arthur Driscoll, assigned from the Honolulu field office to review financial fraud referrals. He opened the folder without ceremony, uncapped his pen, and began reading the way professionals read, quickly, marking small check marks in the margins, his face revealing nothing. Sabine walked him through the structure, the shell companies, the offshore routing, the forged authorization, the adoption certificate, the silence payments, and their connection to a death that had been ruled an accident a quarter century ago. She laid it out the way she laid out everything, precisely, without emotion, letting the documents do the work. I watched a stranger read about my mother's death with professional detachment, and I realized that was exactly what justice looked like. Not passion, not rage, not the cathartic moment you imagine when you picture someone finally hearing the truth. Justice looked like a man in a gray suit making check marks with a ballpoint pen while the air conditioner hummed and fresh coffee cooled in paper cups. Driscoll set down the pen after 40 minutes. He looked at Sabine, then at me. "This will take time," he said, "but we'll reopen the old file." Sabine leaned forward. "We're prepared for the timeline. What we need is confirmation you're treating this as connected, the fraud and the death." Driscoll looked at the documents spread across his side of the table. The forged signature, the wire transfers, the silence payment ledger with its 25 years of monthly entries. "Based on what I'm seeing," he said, "I'd be negligent not to." He tapped the printout with Dwight Kemper's name circled twice. "We're pursuing Kemper separately. Coral Ridge Ventures has been on our radar longer than you'd think. His testimony corroborates your timeline on both the offshore transfers and the payments to Constance Voss." He paused. "Your father wasn't the only one keeping that name quiet." My hands were still in my lap, not trembling, not gripping, just resting. For the first time in weeks, my body wasn't bracing for the next blow. The smell of printer paper and dark roast coffee filled the room, and I picked up my cup and drank. Really drank, tasting it for the first time in weeks, slightly bitter, grounding, the taste of a morning that was finally moving forward instead of circling back. Sabine walked Driscoll out. I heard her heels clicking on the office tile, heard the quiet murmur of professional courtesies at the door, heard the elevator chime, then silence. 2 weeks passed. The investigation moved the way. Investigations move, slowly, methodically, in a language of subpoenas and depositions that Sabine translated for me in weekly phone calls. I went back to work, not at the Prescott Pacific office, not yet, but from my laptop, coordinating with Gil remotely, making sure the Employee Protection Trust was functioning and the projects in progress had the oversight they needed. Then Sabine called on a Tuesday afternoon. Her voice had the particular quality it took on when news was significant, not excited, not grim, but weighted. "His lawyer cut a deal," she said. "Boyd's cooperating, full testimony in exchange for reduced sentencing." I sat on the edge of the hotel bed and let the words settle. Boyd Prescott. The man who had spent 62 years controlling every narrative, every conversation, every room he entered, was telling the truth. Not because it was right, because it was useful. Is it forgiveness if the person confessing is only doing it to negotiate a lighter sentence? Is it truth if it's offered as currency rather than conscience? I didn't know. I wasn't sure it mattered. So he's finally telling the truth, I said. Not because it's right, but because it's useful. It doesn't matter why, Sabine said. What matters is it's on the record now, all of it. Boyd's cooperation arrived like a receipt for something already paid in full. Confirmation, not resolution. He was corroborating every detail. The offshore accounts, the hush payments, the circumstances surrounding Leilani's death. Everything I had pieced together in 12 days, he was now confirming under oath to save himself time behind bars. His final transaction. Trading truth for leniency, the way he'd traded silence for monthly payments. The currency changed, but the man didn't. I thanked Sabine. She told me to rest. I told her I would try. After she left, I sat alone in the conference room. The coffee was cold. The table was clean. The folder was, with Driscoll now, beginning its slow journey through a system that would eventually deliver something close to justice, even if justice always arrived later than it should. My phone lit up on the table, a text from Hadley. Mom wants to talk, not Dad, just her. She says she has something that belonged to your mother, something Dad doesn't know about. I stared at the screen. The air conditioner hummed. The conference room was empty and quiet, and full of the particular stillness that comes after a long fight, the moment when you think it might be over. It wasn't over. I stared at Hadley's text for a full minute before typing back 2 words. I'll listen. Whatever Lorraine had, whatever she claimed Boyd never knew about, it would have to wait. Because Sabine had just walked into the Prescott Pacific boardroom, carrying a file that would change everything I understood about my grandfather. She set the folder on the conference table between stacks of legal documents and the forensic audit reports Gil had been organizing since dawn. Hadley sat at the far end, her laptop open, cross-referencing every shell company against the prosecutor's timeline. She had not mentioned Lorraine's text again. We both knew that conversation was coming, but not yet. This was filed with the county recorder's office 11 years ago, Sabine said, sliding a single document free. A codicil to Orrin Prescott's original operating agreement for Prescott Pacific Construction. It was never activated because the triggering condition had not been met. I picked up the page. The paper was heavier than standard copy stock, the kind my grandfather used for everything he considered permanent. His signature sat at the bottom in the careful, slightly trembling hand I remembered from birthday cards he sent when I was 13, 14, before the stroke took his ability to write. What's the triggering condition? Gil asked from the credenza. Sabine looked at me. Documented evidence of financial fraud by a controlling member of the Prescott family. The room went very still. I read the codicil twice. The language was precise. In the event that forensic accounting, legal proceedings, or regulatory investigation substantiates fraudulent activity by any individual holding controlling interest in Prescott Pacific Construction, all shares held by said individual shall transfer immediately and irrevocably to Keira Prescott, adopted granddaughter of the undersigned. Not to Hadley, not to Boyd, not to a trust or a committee, to me. Hadley closed her laptop. He wrote that 11 years ago? Filed and notarized, Sabine confirmed. My colleague at the recorder's office flagged it during the title search last week. It had been sitting in the system, dormant, waiting for exactly what we handed the federal prosecutors. I pressed my palms flat against the table. 11 years ago, I was 26. I had been working at Prescott Pacific for 3 years. I answered phones and organized permit applications, and learned how to read a balance sheet by staying late and asking Gil questions he was patient enough to answer. But Oren saw something. He saw it before I did. A handwritten note was clipped to the back of the codicil. The paper was yellow, the ink faded to soft brown, the words written in block letters, because by that point his cursive had already started to fail. I give her these shares, not because of blood, but because of character. She will do what is right, even when it costs her. That is not something I taught her. That is something she brought with her. Gil set down the binder he had been holding. He took off his glasses and cleaned them with his tie, which is what he always did when he was trying not to show emotion. He had worked for my grandfather before he worked for Boyd. 18 years in this building, and he had never mentioned this document. I didn't know, he said quietly. Oren never told me. He didn't tell anyone, Sabine said. That was the point. He built a failsafe and trusted the system to hold it. Hadley walked to the window. She looked out at the Kaka'ako street below, where a crew was pouring a foundation for a building that had nothing to do with us. When she turned back, her expression was calm. So you own the company. The codicil transfers controlling interest, Sabine clarified. 62% of all shares. The remaining 38% stays in the family trust. This does not erase Hadley. It restructures authority. Hadley nodded once. Good. That single word carried more weight than any document on the table. She was standing in the ruins of her father's fraud and choosing to let the structure rebuild around someone else. Sabine pushed a signature page toward me. You need to formally accept the transfer. Legal name, full signature, dated. I picked up the pen. I had signed 1,000 documents in this building. Contracts, permits, insurance forms, change orders, every single one as Keira Prescott. But Oren's note was still in my hand, not because of blood, but because of character. I wrote my name slowly, deliberately, feeling each letter like I was learning to spell it for the first time. Keira Voss Prescott. Voss, my mother's name. The name I had never used on a legal document, never claimed in public, never said aloud in this building. I wrote it in the space between the life I had been given and the life I had earned, and when I set the pen down, my hand was steady. Sabine notarized the page. Gil added it to the official binder. Hadley watched from the window and said nothing else, because nothing else needed to be said. Then Gil pulled a second page from the bottom of a stack he had been organizing. He frowned, adjusted his glasses, read it again. This was filed in the same envelope as the codicil, he said. A resignation letter, written by Oren, addressed to Boyd, dated 3 days before Oren died. He looked up at me. It was never sent. The last time I walked up this porch, I came with questions sharp enough to cut. This time I carried 2 plumeria lays and an apology I had been composing for 6 weeks, rewriting it in my head on the flight to Maui, on the drive through Paia, on the gravel path that led to Constance Voss's front door. She was already standing behind the screen, watching me the way you watch weather rolling in from the coast, uncertain whether it brings rain or relief. I brought these for us, I said, holding up the lays, one for wearing, one for the water. She pushed the screen open and took the lay I offered. Her fingers were steadier than the last time. The tea she had waiting inside was sweetened with honey, deliberate, warm, the kind of preparation that meant she had been expecting me, not dreading, expecting. I sat across from her at the same small table where she had first told me about my mother. The ocean pushed its rhythm through the open windows, filling the silences I was not yet ready to fill myself. I need you to hear something, I said. You kept quiet because Boyd made sure you had no other choice. I am not here to blame you. I am here to tell you it is over. Constance set her cup down. Her eyes filled, but she did not look away. I should have fought harder. Every month that check arrived, I told myself next month I would send it back. Did you try? She stood without answering and walked to a drawer in the kitchen. She returned with a manila envelope and spread its contents across the table. 7 wire transfer rejection notices dated over 25 years. 7 attempts to return the money Boyd sent through Pacific Horizon Holdings. Each one bounced back with the same notation. Recipient account closed. Funds returned to sender. She had tried. 7 times she had tried to refuse the silence he was purchasing, and 7 times the system he built sent it right back to her. I kept every receipt, she said. I told myself they were proof that I was not what he made me, but proof does not matter if nobody ever sees it. I see it, I said. I see all of it. Constance told me she used to talk to Leilani's photograph every morning. A full conversation, sometimes 10 minutes, sometimes an hour. What the weather was doing, what the neighbors planted, whether the mangoes came in sweet that year. She said she could finally stop now, not because the grief was gone, but because someone else was here to listen. I reached across the table and held her hand. You kept her memory alive for 25 years. That is not silence. That is endurance. She squeezed back, and the sound she made was not crying. It was something older than crying. It was the exhale of a woman who had been holding her breath since a phone rang at 9:47 on a night that never ended. We sat together until the tea cooled. Then Constance led me down a narrow hallway to a back room I had not entered before. A cedar chest sat beneath the window, its dark grain polished by decades of careful hands. The hinges creaked when she lifted the lid, and the smell rose immediately, cedar wood and dried plumeria petals, layered so deep the scent had become part of the wood itself. Taped inside the lid was a child's crayon drawing. A house, a sun, 2 stick figures holding hands, in wobbly 4-year-old letters across the top, for Auntie Conzi. My handwriting, my drawing, mailed before Boyd cut off all contact between us. I had no memory of making it, but my hands remembered the motion. Constance reached into the chest and lifted out a framed photograph, holding it the way you hold something so fragile that even your breath could damage it. She turned it toward me. Leilani Voss at 23, the year I was born. She was standing on a beach I did not recognize, wearing a white sundress, her hair loose around her shoulders. She was laughing at whoever held the camera, and her hands were raised slightly, caught mid-gesture, as if she had been explaining something important and funny at the same time. I saw my jawline. I saw my eyes. I saw my hands. The same long fingers, the same way of holding them open when speaking, palms up, as if offering something invisible to the world. She was 23 here, Constance said. Same age you were when you graduated from college. She would have been so proud of you. I have her hands, I whispered. You have her everything, sweetheart, especially the parts that mattered. Can I keep this? I have been keeping it for you. I just did not know it until now. I held the photograph, the way you hold something that has been missing so long, you forgot the shape of the empty space it left. I pressed it against my chest and closed my eyes, and for one breath, just one, I let myself feel what it would have been like to be held by the woman in the picture. When I opened my eyes, I saw the pendant, small, silver, hanging from a thin chain around Leilani's neck in the photograph. My hand rose to my own throat before my mind caught up. The same pendant, the same silver curve I had worn since I was 5, always told it was costume jewelry from Lorraine. Constance watched my fingers close around it. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She put that on you the day you were born. The pendant had not left my neck since Paya. I wore it through the flight home, through the taxi ride to my apartment, through the sleepless night I spent sitting on my lanai, watching the harbor lights flicker across the water. Constance's words lived in my chest like a second heartbeat. She put that on you the day you were born. Every morning since, I touched it before I touched anything else. Before coffee, before my phone, before the nameplate on my desk that now read Keira Voss Prescott. Both names cost me something. One cost me a family I thought I knew. The other gave me back a mother I never had the chance to meet. The office was the same room where Boyd once sat behind a locked door and orchestrated every lie that held this company together. Same walls, same windows overlooking the Kaka'ako waterfront, same polished koa desk he had custom-built the year he founded Prescott Pacific. I had the desk refinished, not because it was damaged, but because I wanted my hands to be the first ones to mark the new surface. The space itself had been reclaimed, not just the company. The room where he plotted to frame me was now the room where I rebuilt what he broke. A small plumeria, cutting from Constance's garden, sat in a ceramic pot on the windowsill. It had not bloomed yet. I watered it every morning and told myself patience was not the same as waiting. Gil knocked twice and walked in, carrying a stack of quarterly reports. He set them on the corner of the desk the way he always did, squared to the edge, perfectly aligned, 18 years of habit that no change in leadership would ever alter. 3 months into his new role as VP of Operations, he still knocked before entering. I told him he did not need to. He told me respect was not about need. First clean quarter in over a decade, he said, adjusting his glasses. Feels different, doesn't it? Different good or different strange? Both. The kind of different where you keep checking the numbers because you're not used to them being honest. If you have ever sat in a room that used to belong to someone who hurt you and felt the walls remember what happened there, you know what that morning felt like. The sunlight came through the same glass Boyd stared through when he decided my signature was worth forging. But the light landed on clean books, closed offshore accounts, terminated contracts with every shell company Dwight Kemper ever touched. The ethics board met on Tuesdays. The Employee Protection Fund was fully operational. The numbers were honest because the person reading them finally was. Hadley appeared in the doorway, holding her phone. She leaned against the frame with the casual ease of someone who chose to be here rather than someone who had to be. Constance called, she said. The memorial site is ready. She wants to know if September works. Tell her September is perfect. Mom waited 25 years. A few more weeks won't change that. Hadley paused. It was the first time I had said the word mom in front of her. Not mother, not Leilani, not my biological parent. Mom. She nodded slowly, and whatever passed across her face was not jealousy. It was recognition. She had a mother too, one who forged documents and protected secrets. We had both inherited complicated women. The difference was that mine never got the chance to choose differently. I'll let her know, Hadley said, and walked down the hall. Gil followed a few minutes later, his footsteps fading into the quiet hum of a building coming to life around me. Phones ringing in the outer offices, a printer cycling through permits. The ordinary sounds of a construction company doing what construction companies do, building things that are meant to stand. I sat alone in the silence they left behind. Leilani's photograph faced the window now, framed in dark wood, positioned so the morning light crossed her face first before it reached mine. That arrangement was deliberate. I wanted her to see the day before I did. I wanted her to have the sunrise I could not give her in any other way. My coffee was the same dark roast I drank. The morning I sat in Sabine's office and learned my signature had been stolen. Same beans, same mug. But it tasted like routine now. Not crisis, not survival, just Tuesday. The pendant caught the light, and threw a small bright point against the wall. The same gold, the same chain, the same curve of metal that hung around Leilani's neck 37 years ago when she laughed on a beach and held her hands open to the world, a different woman wearing it forward. I used to think family was the people who chose to keep you, the ones who signed the papers, gave you their name, sat you at their table, and told you that was enough. I believed that for 37 years. I built a life on it. I built a company on it. And when it collapsed, I thought I had nothing left. But I was wrong. What I had left was the truth. And the truth was enough to build on. I set my pen down on the polished wood. I looked at the city through the window Boyd used to own and felt something I had not felt in this room before. Not anger, not grief, not even relief. Peace. I touched the pendant once, then opened the next file on my desk. They taught me blood does not make family, truth does. I spent 37 years trusting the people who raised me. I let loyalty blind me to what was happening right under my own roof. Forged signatures, stolen money, a mother I never knew I had. If I could go back, I would have asked harder questions sooner. I would have trusted the silence less and my instincts more. Do not make the mistake I made. Do not wait until the evidence finds you. What I learned is that the truth does not arrive on your schedule. It comes when it is ready, and when it does, you have to be brave enough to hold it, even when it burns. This was never a revenge story about getting even. It was a revenge story about getting free. Some people hear revenge story and think anger. I understand that, but real justice is not about fury. It is about refusing to let someone else's lies define your life. I believe God put me through every painful chapter for a reason. Not to break me, but to rebuild me into someone strong enough to carry the truth and gentle enough to forgive the people who could not. If this story moved you, I would love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment and tell me, would you have forgiven them or would you have walked away for good? If someone in your life needs to hear this message today, share it with them. And if you have not already, subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. Some details in this story were fictionalized for storytelling and reflection. Any resemblance to real individuals or events is coincidental. What matters most is the lesson, and I hope it stays with you long after you close